The steel door cost me $11,000 and my marriage. Not immediately. The marriage took another 14 months to finish bleeding out. But Diane looked at the credit card statement on a Tuesday evening in March, and something behind her eyes simply departed. I watched it leave. She was standing in the kitchen holding the paper the way you hold a dead bird a cat has brought inside, and she said, "You spent $11,000 on a door for the basement." And it was not a question. It was a coroner's finding. If you've ever made a choice that changed everything, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you want to hear the rest of this, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you think. If you're new here, consider subscribing before we go any further. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I read everyone. I am Gerald Maines, 51 years old. Former HVAC installer, now disability after the fall that compressed my L4 vertebra into something my surgeon described with a word I will not repeat. I own a 3-bedroom split level in Ridgewood Terrace, which is not a terrace but a cul-de-sac in Dayton, Ohio, where 62 homes sit in concentric arcs around a shared retention pond that has never once retained anything but mosquitoes. I know these details matter because specificity is the difference between a man telling you a story and a man asking you to believe him. I need you to believe me. The door was a 12-gauge steel blast door rated to withstand 4,000 pounds of lateral pressure. I installed it myself over 9 days in the stairwell between the main floor and the basement, replacing the hollow core interior door that had been there since the house was built in 1987. I poured a reinforced concrete frame around the jamb. I mounted 3 independent deadbolts with hardened steel throws. I welded the hinges from the inside so they could not be pulled from the pin side. My neighbor, Paul Treader, watched me carry bags of concrete from my truck and said, "Building a bunker, Jerry." And I said, "Just fixing the foundation." And he nodded the way people nod when they have already decided you are broken. I was broken. I want to be clear about that. After Diane left, after the disability checks started arriving with their insulting consistency, after my daughter Nora stopped answering calls, not angrily, just gradually, the way a radio signal fades when you drive out of range, I filled the silence with preparation. Not for zombies, specifically. I am not a prophet. I watched infrastructure fail. I watched the supply chain convulse during the pandemic. I watched my own body betray me without warning on a Tuesday afternoon on a residential rooftop, my boot finding ice where ice should not have existed. I concluded that systems collapse, that readiness is not paranoia, but arithmetic, and that no one who has lain on a roof with a fractured spine waiting 40 minutes for an ambulance should ever trust the word reliable again. So I prepared 6 months of freeze-dried meals, canned protein, water filtration, medical supplies, batteries, a hand crank radio, and 2 firearms I knew how to use, and 1 I did not. The basement was climate-controlled because I had installed the HVAC myself, the one competence my back could not confiscate. I sealed the basement windows with steel plates bolted into the concrete foundation. I installed a composting toilet. I ran the ventilation through a filtered shaft that exited through a modified dryer vent on the east side of the house. Diane called it my coffin. Nora, during the last conversation we had before the outbreak, called it sad. Paul Treader, who would later pound on my steel door until his hands were pulped, called it smart. But by then he was screaming it through 6 inches of metal, and I could barely hear him over his wife. That was 19 days ago, or 20. The hand crank radio gives me time in intervals. Emergency broadcasts stamped with dates, but I have slept in fragments, and I'm no longer certain which fragments contained waking. What I know is this. I am alone in a basement in Dayton, Ohio. The steel door is holding. The food supply, which should last 6 months for 1 person, will last considerably longer than it needs to, because the math I did not do, the calculation I never wrote on any of my meticulous inventory sheets, is how long a man can live in a room he built to save himself when the saving is the thing that is killing him. Let me start from when it mattered. 11 days before I sealed the door, the news was still using the word rabies. I remember this because I was in the basement calibrating the water filtration system, checking output rates, marking gallons per hour on the clipboard I kept zip-tied to the shelving unit. And the radio was tuned to WHIO. A field correspondent in Louisville was describing a mass casualty event at a hospital where patients in the ER waiting room had attacked triage staff. She used the word rabies 3 times. She used the word unprecedented 4 times. She did not use the word dead in the way it would later require using. My phone buzzed. Nora. Not a call. A text, which was the medium she had assigned to our relationship, the bandwidth she had decided I deserved. It said, "Are you watching this Louisville thing?" I typed back, "Yes, you okay?" She replied, "I'm in Portland, Dad." "It's in Kentucky." I typed, "I know where Louisville is." She did not reply. That was the last exchange I would have with my daughter, in which her tone was dismissive rather than afraid. 3 days later, the word rabies was retired. The CDC held a press conference I watched on the small television I had mounted on the basement wall. One indulgence Diane would have mocked. And a woman in a navy blazer, whose name I did not catch, said that the infectious agent was not rabies, was not any known pathogen, and was spreading through bite transmission with a conversion window of 6 to 18 hours. She did not use the word zombie. No one in an official capacity ever used that word, while the official capacity still existed. The internet used it immediately. Paul Treader used it the next afternoon, standing at the fence between our yards while I reinforced the steel plates on the east side basement windows. "Zombies, Jerry," he said. "You were right." I had never said the word zombie to Paul or to anyone. But correction seemed beside the point. That evening I drove to Meyer. The shelves were thinning but not bare. People moved quickly and avoided eye contact, which in Dayton is unusual. This is a city where strangers in grocery stores discuss the Reds' bullpen. I bought 40 pounds of rice, 20 pounds of dried beans, 18 cans of tuna, bleach, hydrogen peroxide, and all the D-cell batteries remaining on the peg. The cashier, a young man with a neck tattoo of a hummingbird, said, "Everyone's buying batteries today." I said, "People are scared." He said, "Are you?" I said, "I've been scared for 3 years. This is just confirmation." That was not bravado. I want you to understand, my preparation was not confidence. It was the organized expression of a terror that had been living in my chest since I lay on that rooftop and understood that the distance between ordinary Tuesday and shattered vertebra was 1 patch of ice and 1/4 second. I built the basement because I was afraid. I stocked it because I was afraid. I sealed it because I was afraid. The difference between me and Paul Treader was not that I was brave and he was not. The difference was that my fear had a longer lead time. On day 8 before sealing, the Louisville correspondent stopped broadcasting. Cincinnati reported its first cases, a cluster at a meatpacking facility in Norwood, then a second cluster at Christ Hospital. I pulled up a map and measured. Cincinnati to Dayton, 54 miles on I-75. Average spread rate based on the tracking data available online was difficult to calculate because the data was contradictory. But the clusters were no longer clusters. They were, if you plotted them, a gradient. A wash of color bleeding north along the highway corridor like watercolor on wet paper. I called Nora. She answered for the first time in weeks. "Dad," she said, and her voice had changed. Not panicked, but stripped of the protective irony she wore like a jacket. "Dad, are you watching?" I said, "Come home." She said, "I'm in Portland." I said, "Come home now, Nora. Drive. Don't fly. The airports will close." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You actually think this is it, don't you?" I said, "I think this is something. Come home and be wrong with me." She said she would think about it. She did not come. 6 days before sealing, a woman named Colleen Marsh knocked on my front door. I knew Colleen the way you know people in a cul-de-sac. She was a presence at the periphery, a Toyota Highlander pulling in 3 houses down, a wave at the mailbox. She was perhaps 40, with short gray blonde hair, and the kind of direct eye contact that always made me look away first. She worked for the county health department. I knew this because Paul had mentioned it once. In the tone men use when they want you to know a woman is impressive, without admitting they find her attractive. "Gerald," she said. She had never used my name before. "Can I come in?" She stood in my living room, looking at the floor reinforcement I had added above the basement ceiling, visible as new lumber against the old joists, and said, "You're serious about this?" I said, "Would you like coffee?" She said, "I would like to know what you know." I said, "I don't know anything. I prepare." She said, "Then I'd like to know what you've prepared for." Colleen had come because the county health department had been federalized 3 days earlier and then, 20 hours ago, unfederalized, which meant the federal coordinators had simply stopped responding. She had driven to the regional office in Moraine and found it locked. Lights on, cars in the lot. Nobody inside. She had gone home, watched the broadcasts, plotted the same gradient I had plotted, and reached the same conclusion but with better data. The wavefront was not following I-75 exclusively. It was propagating through population density nodes. Dayton was not 54 miles from Cincinnati. Dayton was, by infection math, about 6 days from Cincinnati. She had walked the cul-de-sac knocking on doors, asking who was prepared, and everyone had pointed her to me. "I'm not running a shelter," I said. "I'm not asking for shelter," she said. "I'm asking what you see." What I saw, when I pulled up my inventory spreadsheet and my hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, was this. Ridgewood Terrace was topographically unremarkable, but logistically defensible. 1 road in, 1 road out. The retention pond on the south side created a natural barrier, shallow and marshy, difficult to cross quickly. 62 homes in a compressed footprint meant materials were abundant. The problem was people. 62 homes meant perhaps 150 residents, most of whom were doing what humans always do in the early phase of a disaster, which is believe that the disaster is happening to someone else. Colleen sat at my kitchen table and studied the map. "You've marked houses," she said. I had. Green for occupied and cooperative. Yellow for occupied and unknown. Red for empty. I had walked the cul-de-sac on 4 separate evenings. "How do you know the Bechtels are gone?" she asked, pointing at a red-marked house. "Garage open, mail accumulating, dog barking non-stop for 2 days, then silent," I said. She looked at me. "The dog," I said. "I don't know what happened to the dog." She said, "Gerald, the dog matters." I did not understand what she meant until later. That night, the Cincinnati broadcasts switched from incident reports to evacuation orders, whole neighborhoods instructed to move north. The irony was architectural. They were sending people toward us. I stood in my basement with the radio and listened to a man on a ham frequency, not official, just a person with a transmitter, describe what he was seeing from the roof of a parking garage in Kettering, which was not Cincinnati, which was not 54 miles away, which was 11 miles south of my house. He said, "There are people on Wilmington Pike, and they are not walking right." He said, "I can see maybe 30 of them, and they are moving together, but not like a group, like a liquid." He said, "I am going to go inside now." The frequency went silent. Not dead. Silent. The carrier signal persisted. He had simply stopped speaking. I called Nora. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. I said, "It's in Kettering. I'm sealing the basement tomorrow. I love you. Please call me." She did not call. I went upstairs and looked south through the kitchen window. The streetlights of Ridgewood Terrace illuminated nothing unusual. 2 houses down, Paul Tredder's television flickered blue through his curtains. Somewhere a dog barked. Not the Bechtels' dog, a different one. I began carrying the final supplies downstairs. Colleen came back at 6 the next morning with a printed spreadsheet. She had gone door to door again, this time not asking who was prepared, but who was still here. Of 62 homes, she confirmed 41 occupied, 9 confirmed empty, 12 no response. She had organized the occupied homes by household size, noted medical needs were disclosed, and flagged 4 homes with elderly residents living alone. The spreadsheet was clean and categorized with colored rows. She handed it to me at my front door and said, "You need to know who's around you, even if you won't help them." I let that land. She was not wrong, and she was not kind about it, and I appreciated both. "I'm sealing today," I said. "The basement is built for one." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking to come in. I'm telling you what I'm doing." What she was doing was organizing the cul-de-sac's above-ground defense. She had identified the one road-in choke point and proposed a vehicle barricade across Ridgewood Drive where it met the feeder road. She had spoken to a man named Dean Alcott at the far end of the retired Army. I'd marked his house green, and he had agreed to coordinate a watch rotation. She needed nothing from me. She was informing me as a courtesy, the way you inform a neighbor you are having a tree removed. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because if we fail up here, whatever comes through is going to reach your door," she said. "And I want you to know we tried." I sealed the basement at 4 that afternoon. I carried the last items down. Fresh water in 7-gallon jugs, a final load of canned goods, the medical kit, the ammunition, and I pulled the steel door closed and shot all 3 deadbolts. The sound was specific, 3 metallic percussions that each said something final. I stood on the basement side and put my palm flat against the steel and felt its temperature, which was the temperature of the house, which was the last time the basement would share a climate with the world above. I had left a 2-way radio with Colleen. Motorola, 16-mile range, charged. Channel 6. Check in at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. She said, "Fine." There was no warmth in the exchange, and I did not expect any. Colleen Marsh operated at the frequency of utility, and I was, at that moment, a utility she had decided to maintain contact with. The first night sealed was the loudest quiet I have experienced. The basement was climate-controlled, 70 degrees, the hum of the filtration system providing a low mechanical drone. But the absence of the house above me, its creaks, its furnace cycling, its plumbing, was disorienting. I had lived in this house for 23 years. I had heard it breathe every night. Now I was inside its chest cavity with the ribs sealed shut, and the breathing was gone. At 8 p.m., Colleen radioed, "Barricade is up. Dean has 4 people on first watch. Nothing visible from the south. Cincinnati broadcasts are gone. Military frequency says Wright Pat is operational but not accepting civilians. Over." Wright-Patterson Air Force Base sits northeast of Dayton. I had considered it early and dismissed it. Military installations in crises become fortresses that face outward, not shelters that face inward. Colleen confirming this was not news, but it was weight. It meant the cul-de-sac was its own nation now. 62 homes, 41 occupied, 1 road, 1 pond, 1 vehicle barricade, and whatever Dean Alcott remembered from whatever war he had fought. I ate a freeze-dried meal, chicken and rice, which tasted like the idea of chicken discussed by someone who had once been in the same room as rice. And I noted it on the inventory sheet. Day 1, meal 1. 5 months, 29 days of food remaining. I wrote the number, and I stared at it, and I felt something I did not expect, which was not relief or fear, but a kind of grief that arrived prematurely, as though the number itself was already mourning its own countdown. Above me, the house held its breath. Day 2. Colleen's morning check-in was clinical. No contact through the night. Dean's watch reported headlights on the feeder road at 3 a.m. That slowed, paused, then reversed. Could have been someone assessing the barricade. No way to know. The Kettering ham operator had not returned to his frequency. O was running a loop. The same emergency broadcast recycling every 12 minutes, which meant the station was automated, which meant the people who ran it were gone. I spent the morning organizing what did not need organizing. The basement was already meticulous. I had arranged it over 3 years, but the act of touching every item, confirming its location, reading its label, gave my hands something to do that was not opening the door. The steel door had a peephole I'd installed myself, a wide-angle lens rated for exterior doors, and through it I could see the bottom 4 stairs and the hallway above. The hallway was dim. The house's power was still on, which meant the grid was still on, which meant Dayton was still functioning at the infrastructural level, even if it was failing at every other. At 11 a.m., I heard footsteps above me. Not the rhythmic steps of a person walking through a house. These were arrhythmic, clustered, like someone moving furniture or searching. I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw nothing on the stairs. The footsteps were in the kitchen, directly above the basement's north wall. I held still. The footsteps stopped, started again, moved toward the front of the house. Then I heard my front door open. I had left it unlocked, an oversight that now filled my mouth with copper. And close, I radioed Colleen. Someone was in my house, just left through the front door. She replied immediately. Description. I said, couldn't see, heard only. Irregular gate. A pause. Dean sending someone to check the exterior. Stay sealed. I stayed sealed. I did not need to be told. 14 minutes later, Colleen radioed back. Your front door is open. No one visible. There are marks on the door frame. Dean says they look like fingernail gouges. Another pause. Gerald, we have visual confirmation from the south barricade. There are figures on the feeder road. At least 12. They are not moving toward us yet. They're standing in the roadway facing different directions. Dean says they look confused. Over. Confused. The word carried a strange weight. The broadcasts, the online footage before the internet became unreliable, the ham operator's description. All of it had painted the infected as relentless, directional, driven by stimulus. But confused suggested something else, something early, something still becoming what it would become. How far from the barricade? I asked. Quarter mile, maybe less. Dean has binoculars. He says some of them are in hospital gowns. Kettering has a hospital. 3 hospitals, 11 miles south. The math was available to anyone who wanted to do it. But I found myself unwilling to perform the calculation because the calculation's answer was a clock. And I did not want to know how fast it was running. That afternoon, the power grid dropped for 90 seconds. Just long enough for the basement to go dark, for the filtration hum to cease, for the silence to become absolute. A silence so total I could hear my own blood in my ears, a sound like a river in a pipe. And then it returned. The lights flickered and caught. Hum resumed. But the 90 seconds had shown me what waited beneath the infrastructure. A darkness that was not just visual but ontological. A preview of a world in which the systems I had built my shelter inside of simply stopped. I checked the battery backup. Functional. The hand crank radio. Functional. The LED lanterns. 6. Fully charged. I had prepared for grid failure. I had prepared for everything quantifiable. What I had not prepared for was the footsteps above me. The knowledge that my house, the structure I had lived inside for 2 decades, was no longer mine. It belonged to whatever had opened my front door and walked through my kitchen with a gait that did not sound like walking. I ate my second meal, noted it on the clipboard. 5 months, 28 days. The clipboard did not care about the footsteps. I envied the clipboard. Day 4 brought Paul Treader to the steel door. I had expected this, though not the way it arrived. At 2 in the afternoon, Colleen's midday check-ins had begun by then. 3 per day instead of 2. The frequency itself, a kind of seismograph. I heard this basement stairwell door open. This was the upper door, the ordinary wooden door at the top of the stairs, which I had not reinforced because the steel door at the bottom was the choke point. Footsteps descended. These were human footsteps, recognizable, deliberate. Then Paul's voice, close to the steel, shaking but intelligible. "Jerry, it's Paul. Open the door." I put my eye to the peephole. Paul's face was distorted by the wide-angle lens into something aquatic, his features bulging at the center. He was pale. His eyes were red. He was holding his left hand wrapped in a kitchen towel that was soaked through with something dark. "What happened to your hand?" I said through the door. "I cut it on the barricade." "Jerry, open the door." "Lisa's upstairs. They're in the cul-de-sac." "Who was in the cul-de-sac?" "Who do you think?" His voice cracked upward. "There are 6 or 7 of them near the pond. Dean's people are at the barricade, but these came from the east, from the Bechtels' yard, through the back fences. Open the door." I radioed Colleen. "Paul Treader is at my door. Says infected in the cul-de-sac, east side near the pond. Can you confirm?" Colleen's response was immediate, but her voice had a texture I had not heard before, compressed, like she was speaking through clenched teeth. "Confirmed. We have visual. Dean is repositioning. Gerald, we have a problem. The ones on the feeder road have started moving toward the barricade. All of them. More than 12 now. We count at least 30. Paul was pressing his face against the peephole from the other side. "Jerry, I can hear you talking to someone. Open the door. Please. I have Lisa." Lisa Treader was Paul's wife of 15 years. I had attended their anniversary party, sat in their backyard, eaten potato salad Lisa made with a recipe she said was her grandmother's. These are the details that press against you when you are on one side of a steel door and a man you know is on the other. "Paul, I can't open the door." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and contained the entire renegotiation of every interaction we had ever had. Every borrowed tool, every wave across the driveway, every moment of ambient, neighborly goodwill, being revised into its final ledger entry. You can't or you won't. The basement is built for one. There are 3 of us, Jerry. 3. You have 6 months of food. That's 2 months each. 2 months is enough. This will be over in 2 months. The arithmetic was correct, and the premise was wrong, and I knew both things simultaneously. It would not be over in 2 months. It would not be over. But the arithmetic, the simple division, the sharing, sat in front of me with moral clarity I could not refute. 3 people, 6 months of food, 2 months each. The math was clean. The math did not account for water filtration rates, or air exchange capacity, or the psychological architecture of 3 people in a 900-square-foot basement, or the fact that Paul's hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked towel, and I did not know what had cut him. "Paul, what cut your hand?" "A piece of sheet metal on the barricade, Jerry. It's a cut. It's not a bite. Look at it." He unwrapped the towel and held his hand up to their peephole. Through the fisheye lens, I saw a laceration across his palm, linear, consistent with a metal edge. Not a bite pattern, but the lens distorted everything, and certainty was a luxury the world had stopped manufacturing. "Where's Lisa?" "Upstairs, in your kitchen. She won't come down until she knows the door is open." Above me, I heard a woman crying. The sound came through the floor joists like something buried trying to surface. I looked at the 3 deadbolts. I looked at my inventory sheet. I looked at the peephole. I opened the first bolt. Paul came through the door first, pulling Lisa by the wrist. She was wearing a bathrobe and sneakers without socks, and her face had the particular blankness of someone who has passed through fear into the administrative numbness that follows. I closed the door behind them. 3 deadbolts. The sound was the same. 3 metallic declarations, but the meaning had changed. The first time I sealed the door, I was locking the world out. This time, I was locking us in together, which is a different kind of entombment. Paul's hand was bleeding through the towel. I sat him on the cot I had set up against the south wall and opened the medical kit. The laceration was clean-edged, approximately 3 inches across the meat of his palm, deep enough to see the white flash of fascia, but not deep enough to sever tendons. I irrigated it with saline, applied butterfly closures, wrapped it in gauze. He watched me work with an expression I recognized from clients whose furnaces I had repaired. The particular gratitude of a person watching competence they do not possess being applied to their problem. "Thank you," he said. I said, "Don't move it for 2 days." Lisa had not spoken. She stood near the shelving unit, holding her own elbows, scanning the basement with the precise eye movement of someone cataloging escape routes. I had seen this in Diane once, during a fight in the early bad years. The moment when a person in a room begins planning how to leave it. "Lisa," I said, "there's water in the blue jugs. Cups are on the second shelf." She looked at me. "Thank you, Gerald." Her voice was hoarse and formal. She poured water and drank it standing up, facing the door. I radioed Colleen. "Paul and Lisa Treader are in the basement with me. Door is sealed. What's your situation?" Colleen's voice came back with the sound of wind behind it. She was outside. Dean engaged the group near the pond. 3 down. The rest scattered into the yards between Ridgewood and the houses backing up to Palmer. We've lost visual. The feeder road group has reached the barricade. They're pressing against the cars. Not climbing. Pressing. It's Gerald. It's like watching water against a dam. They just push. Is the barricade holding? For now. Dean wants to fall back to the inner ring. Pull everyone into the center 12 houses and create a secondary perimeter. It means abandoning the outer homes, including mine. Your house is in the outer ring. Yes, but your basement is underground, and your door is steel. You're not really part of the neighborhood anymore, Gerald. You're below it. She was right. The topology had shifted. I was not a house in a cul-de-sac. I was a sealed chamber beneath a house that was about to become undefended territory. The distinction mattered because whatever Dean's inner ring strategy accomplished above ground, my survival depended entirely on the 6 inches of steel at the bottom of my stairs, and the assumption that what was pressing against the barricade could not find or breach a subterranean door. Paul was examining the basement with the expression of a man on a house tour. "You really did all this," he said. "The shelving, the ventilation, the toilet." He pointed at the composting unit in the corner. "That's a toilet?" I said. "It's a composting system." He said, "It's a bucket with a seat." He was not wrong, but I did not appreciate the reduction. That evening, I recalculated. 3 people changed every variable. Water filtration produced 4 gallons per day, adequate for 1. Sufficient for 3 if rationed. Insufficient for 3 if anyone became ill, or if the physical demands of the space increased metabolic need. Food was the simpler math. 6 months became 2. But 2 months was abstract. 60 days was concrete. 60 days was the number I wrote on the clipboard beneath the meal count. And when Paul saw me write it, he said, "What's that number?" And I said, "How long we eat." And the room became a place where a number hung in the air like a sentence handed down by a judge who was not present. Lisa sat on the floor against the wall and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Her eyelids moved. Day 6. Colleen's broadcasts had become the architecture of my hours. Without them, time in the basement was a formless substance. It pooled and thickened and refused to pass. With them, the day had 3 columns: morning, midday, evening. Each one brought information that was terrible and specific, and I discovered that terrible specificity was preferable to comfortable ignorance, because at least it gave the mind something to organize. Morning report. Dean's inner ring held 13 houses with 31 people. The vehicle barricade on the feeder road had been breached overnight. Not torn apart, but simply displaced. The cars pushed aside by sustained pressure from a crowd that had grown to what Dean estimated at 80. 80 people who were no longer people. Pressing against steel and fiberglass with a patience that was more disturbing than violence, because patience implied something worse than hunger. It implied instruction. Dean had fallen back. The inner ring's perimeter was now a combination of overturned furniture, garden fencing, and 2 trucks parked nose to tail across the narrowest gap between houses. "It won't hold," Colleen said. "Dean knows it won't hold. He's buying time. Time for what? He has a shortwave. He's been broadcasting to Wrightpad on military frequencies. No response. He's been broadcasting to anyone. Last night, someone answered from Brookville. A group at a church. They have vehicles and fuel. They're willing to take people, but they want to know numbers. Brookville was 20 miles west, 20 miles of open road, or 20 miles of road that used to be open and was now a corridor through territory that no one had scouted. The distance was trivial by car and impossible by mathematics. How many infected per mile? What density constituted impassable? Whether a convoy of civilian vehicles could push through a crowd the way the crowd had pushed through the barricade. Colleen, are you considering evacuation? Dean is. I'm considering whether evacuation is a word that applies when you don't know what you're evacuating into. Paul had been listening. The radio was not private. In 900 square feet, nothing was private. Privacy was the first casualty of the basement, before comfort, before patience, before the illusion that 3 adults could share a toilet separated from the living space by a curtain made from a bed sheet and maintain the fiction of dignity. Paul said, "We should go with them." I said, "We are in a sealed basement with 2 months of food." He said, "We are in a tomb, Jerry." Lisa, who had spoken perhaps 30 words in 2 days, said, "He's right." She said it the way she said everything, quietly, directed at no one, deposited into the air like a coin into a fountain. This is not living. This is storage. I did not argue because the argument available to me, that storage was preferable to death, was true and also monstrous, and I could hear its monstrousness even as I formulated it. They were not wrong. The basement was engineered for survival, not habitation. It was designed to keep a body alive, and I had confused that with keeping a person alive. And the distinction was standing in front of me, wearing a bathrobe and sneakers without socks. That evening, Colleen reported that the Brookville group had confirmed they would send 3 vehicles at dawn in 2 days. Pickup point would be the intersection of Ridgewood Drive and Palmer Road, which was 400 yards from my front door, and required crossing the ground that was now contested. Dean was organizing the evacuation. 31 people, 3 vehicles, 1 trip. Anyone not at the intersection at dawn would be left. "Gerald," Colleen said, "I need to know. Are you coming?" I looked at my basement, my inventory, my clipboard with its diminishing number, my steel door with its 3 deadbolts. I looked at Paul's hand, healing now beneath clean gauze. I looked at Lisa, who was sitting on the cot reading the back of a freeze-dried meal packet as though it contained a message from a civilization she had once belonged to. "I'll let you know," I said. Paul said nothing. Lisa turned the packet over and read the other side. The air system hummed. Somewhere above, something heavy fell and did not get up. Day 7. I woke to Paul standing over me. He was not threatening. His posture was slack, arms at his sides, bandaged hand cradled against his stomach. But the sight of a silhouette looming above you in a dim basement triggers something older than reason. I flinched. He stepped back. "Sorry," he said. "I couldn't sleep. Jerry, we need to talk about tomorrow. Dawn is day after tomorrow. I know when it is. I need to talk about it now because Lisa won't go unless I convince her. And I can't convince her unless I know what you're doing." This confused me. Lisa wants to stay? Lisa doesn't want anything. Lisa has stopped wanting. She is in a state where she will do what the nearest person tells her to do. And right now, the nearest person is me. And if I say stay, she stays. And if I say go, she goes. And I need to say the right thing, and I don't know what the right thing is. I'm asking you. It was the most honest thing Paul had ever said to me. In 3 years of neighboring, our conversations had been transactional. Weather, lawn care, the shared irritation of the retention pond's mosquitoes. Now he was standing in my basement, asking me to determine the course of his wife's life, and the weight of that request was not metaphorical. I felt it settle across my shoulders like a beam. "What do you want to do, Paul?" I want to go. I want to get in a truck and drive to Brookville and be in a church with other people and not be underground. But I don't trust wanting. Wanting got me into debt. Wanting got me a boat I used twice. I don't trust what feels right. I trust what is right. And I'm asking you what is right, because you're the one who built a basement with a steel door, which means you think about this differently than I do. I sat up on my sleeping pad. I had given them the cot, alternating nights, which was the geometry of courtesy in confined space. And I considered his question. The answer was not simple because it required weighing incommensurable things. The certainty of the basement against the uncertainty of the convoy. The diminishing timeline of supplies against the permanent timeline of psychological disintegration. The steel door against the road. I could calculate food and water. I could not calculate what it cost 3 people to live in a room where the ceiling was also a floor that things walked across at night. I'll tell you what I know, I said. The basement is viable for 53 more days at current consumption. The road to Brookville is 20 miles and unverified. The convoy is 3 civilian vehicles with no confirmed armament or escort. The intersection rendezvous requires crossing 400 yards of open ground that is currently occupied. Those are the facts. And what do the facts say? The facts don't say anything, Paul. Facts are inert. They sit there. You have to pick them up and carry them somewhere. He stared at me. That's the most unhelpful thing anyone has ever said to me. I know. Jerry, I'm begging you. I looked at the steel door. I had built it to keep me alive. It was keeping me alive. It was performing exactly as designed, fulfilling every specification I had engineered, and it was doing so with the perfect indifference of metal, which does not care whether the life it preserves is worth preserving. The door did not know that I had not spoken to my daughter in 8 days. The door did not know that the clipboard with its countdown was becoming a document I could not look at without feeling the specific nausea of watching your own future shrink in ruled lines. We go, I said. Paul exhaled. It was not a sigh. It was the sound of a structure releasing load. I radioed Colleen. 3 for the convoy. Dawn. We'll be at the intersection. Good, she said. And then, for the first time, she added something personal. Gerald, bring the medical kit. I began packing. The basement watched me with the mute attention of a room that has been abandoned before. I packed with the specificity of a man dismantling his own logic. Every item I placed in the 3 backpacks. 1 for me, 1 for Paul, 1 for Lisa. Represented a calculation I had made months or years earlier, now being extracted from its context and repurposed. The freeze-dried meals, portioned into 7-day supplies per pack. Water purification tablets, 30 per person. The medical kit Colleen had requested. 2 of the 3 firearms. The 9mm I knew and the shotgun I mostly knew. The third, a .22 rifle, I left because 3 guns for 3 people was a distribution that assumed all 3 people could shoot, and Lisa had looked at the weapons on the shelf during her first day underground with the expression of someone viewing an insect she wanted removed. Paul packed methodically, following my instructions without commentary. His hand had healed enough to grip, but not to squeeze. I showed him how to cradle the shotgun's forestock against his palm without engaging the laceration. Lisa packed with the careful detachment of someone folding clothes for a trip she did not choose. At one point, she held up a thermal blanket. Silver mylar, the kind that crinkles like a candy wrapper, and said, "This weighs nothing." I said, 4 ounces. She said, "No, it weighs nothing. It's not real. None of this is real." I did not correct her because she was describing an emotional state, not a physical property. And correcting emotional states with physical facts is a habit that cost me a marriage. Dawn was 5 hours away. Colleen's final evening broadcast laid out the plan. Dean would position his remaining armed volunteers, 7 people, various firearms, uncertain ammunition, along the route from the inner ring to the intersection. The Brookville convoy would arrive at first light. 3 vehicles, room for everyone. The timing required coordination that assumed the infected would behave as observed. drawn to sound, slow to redirect, incapable of anticipatory positioning. These assumptions were built on 6 days of observation by people who were not epidemiologists or military strategists, but homeowners with binoculars and fear. What if they've learned? Paul asked. He was sitting on the cot tying his shoes with his good hand and his teeth. What if they're different at dawn? Then we adapt. Adapt how? I don't know, Paul. I've never run across 400 yards of contested ground at dawn. This is not an area of professional expertise. He laughed. It was the first laughter the basement had contained, and the sound was so foreign to the space that it seemed to bounce off the concrete walls and return altered, as though the room had tried to digest it and failed. At 3 a.m., I stood at the steel door with my hand on the first deadbolt. Behind me, Paul and Lisa stood with their packs. The basement hummed. The clipboard hung on its nail with the inventory sheet still attached. The number 53 written in my handwriting, which now seemed like a message from a person I had been and would not be again. I opened the first bolt, the second, the third. The door swung inward on its welded hinges, and the stairwell air hit my face, warmer than the basement, carrying a smell I had not encountered in the controlled environment below. It was organic, sour, layered, spoiled food from the kitchen above, mildew from the sealed house's stagnant air, and beneath both, something metallic and biological that I chose not to identify. We climbed the stairs. Paul first, shotgun awkward in his injured grip. Lisa second, me last, closing the steel door behind me for what I understood might be the final time. I did not bolt it. I left it unlocked. The gesture was not symbolic. If we needed to retreat, fumbling with deadbolts in the dark would cost seconds we would not have. But it felt symbolic, and I let it. The house was dark. The power had failed sometime in the night, finally and without the 90-second reprieve it had offered before. I clicked on the flashlight and moved through my own home, as though it belonged to someone else. The kitchen floor had footprints and dust I had not left. We exited through the back door because the front faced south, toward the pond, toward where the largest concentrations had been reported. The backyard was small. Diane had planted hostas along the fence that were now brown and flattened from neglect. And the fence itself was 4-foot cedar, decorative rather than defensive. I had never resented a fence before. I resented this one, with the specific anger of a man who understands that aesthetics and survival share no vocabulary. The pre-dawn air was cold. Late autumn in Dayton carries a dampness that settles in the sinuses, and I breathed it in and felt the basement leave my lungs in a single exhale, replaced by atmosphere that was unfiltered, uncontrolled, and tasted like a world I had forgotten existed. Paul was beside me, breathing hard through his nose, scanning the yards to our east. Lisa was behind me, one hand gripping the strap of her backpack, the other pressed flat against the back of the house, as though maintaining contact with the structure would keep her tethered to solidity. Colleen's voice on the radio low. Gerald, we have you visual from Dean's position on the Morrow roof. Your path north through the Kowalski and Fenn yards is clear. Move now. We moved. The Kowalski yard had a swimming pool, drained, its empty basin a pale blue oval in the darkness like a dead eye staring upward. We skirted it. The Fenn yard had a trampoline that Paul clipped with his pack, and the resulting shudder of springs and fabric produced a sound that, in another context, would have been comic. And in this context, stopped all 3 of our hearts for the 2 seconds it took the noise to dissipate. We reached the north edge of the cul-de-sac's inner ring. Dean Alcott was there, visible as a shape on the Morrow family's roof, crouched behind the chimney with a scoped rifle resting on the brickwork. He waved once, a sharp lateral motion, not greeting but direction. He pointed northeast. We moved northeast. The intersection of Ridgewood Drive and Palmer Road was 400 yards away. I could see it in the gray pre-light, a wide T-junction with a gas station on one corner, dark, and a dental office on the other. its cheerful signage. Bright Smiles Family Dentistry, now an artifact from a civilization that had concerned itself with enamel. Between us and the intersection lay open ground, the feeder road, its collapsed vehicle barricade pushed aside like furniture after a party, and beyond it the suburban terrain of Palmer Road's first block. The collapsed barricade told a story. The cars, 2 sedans and a pickup, had been shoved apart by sustained pressure, their frames bent inward at the contact points. The asphalt around them was marked with drag patterns I did not examine closely. Something dark had pooled and dried near the pickup's rear tire. We crossed the barricade gap in single file. Colleen was waiting on the other side, standing in the shadow of a retaining wall with 3 other people I recognized only vaguely. A younger couple and an older woman with a wheeled oxygen concentrator that made a faint electrical hum with each breath cycle. Colleen looked at me and nodded. She looked at my pack and nodded again. She looked at Paul's bandaged hand and her eyes stayed there 1 second longer than efficiency required. "Convoy is 3 minutes out," she said. "Dean has eyes on 2 groups. One southeast, 8 to 10, moving along Palmer, and one south in the Ridgewood yards. The south group is larger. He can't get a count. Can we hold 3 minutes? We can hold 3 minutes if they don't hear the trucks." The paradox was architectural. Our rescue was a convoy of internal combustion engines, and the infected were drawn to sound. The vehicles that would save us would also announce us. Dean's job was not to defeat the groups converging on the intersection, but to delay them for the 90 seconds it would take to load 34 people into 3 trucks. 90 seconds. A song and a half. An elevator ride. The smallest unit of time that could contain the entire difference between continuation and its opposite. We waited. The oxygen concentrator hummed. The sky paled. Then headlights appeared on Palmer Road, moving fast. The 3 vehicles materialized out of the gray dawn like something summoned rather than driven. A white Ford F250 in the lead, a green Chevy Suburban behind it, and a battered yellow school bus bringing up the rear, its emergency flashers pulsing amber against the low cloud ceiling. The bus was unexpected. It changed the mathematics of loading and transformed the entire operation from a compression problem into a capacity problem, which was better, which meant someone in Brookville had thought about this more carefully than I had assumed. They did not stop gently. The F250 pulled perpendicular across the intersection, creating a barrier between us and the southeast approach. The Suburban swung wide and parked parallel. The bus stopped with its folding door facing our group, and a man in a canvas jacket and a Cincinnati Bengals cap leaned out and said, "How many?" 34, Colleen said. "Get them on." What followed was not orderly. It was not chaotic either. It occupied a space between those words that I associate with HVAC emergencies, the controlled urgency of people performing practiced motions under novel stress. The older woman with the oxygen concentrator went first, lifted by Paul and the man in the Bengals cap, her machine handed up separately by Lisa, who performed this task with a competence that surprised me until I remembered that I knew almost nothing about Lisa Treader beyond her potato salad and her silence. People appeared. From the retaining wall, from behind the dental office, from the alley beside the gas station. Dean's inner ring residents, moving in groups of 3 and 4, packs on their backs, children held against chests. One man carrying a cat in a pillowcase that yowled with a sound that cut through the dawn like a blade through paper. They loaded onto the bus with the efficiency of people who had been told exactly one thing: get on and sit down. Dean's rifle cracked twice from the Morrow rooftop, 400 yards behind us. The reports were flat in the cold air. Not the cinematic boom of movies, but a dry snap, like a branch breaking under weight. I did not see what he was shooting at. I did not look. Looking would have cost seconds, and seconds were the only currency left. Colleen was counting. She stood at the bus door with her spreadsheet. The same spreadsheet she had brought into my front door 9 days earlier, now annotated and re-annotated in multiple colors, and she checked names as people boarded. Morrow family 4, Alcott. Where's Dean? The man in the Bengals cap said. He's the shooter. He knows. Colleen made a mark. Treader 2. Paul climbed the bus steps, turned, and reached his good hand down for Lisa. She took it. She climbed. She did not look back. Mains, Colleen said. I was standing on the asphalt of the intersection holding my backpack by one strap, looking south toward Ridgewood Terrace. The cul-de-sac was visible as a geometry of roof lines against the brightening sky, and among those roof lines was mine. The split level I'd lived in for 23 years, the structure that contained a basement with a steel door that was, at this moment, unlocked and slightly ajar. I thought of the clipboard on its nail, the inventory sheet, the number 53, which referred to days of food for one person in a room that no longer held any people. Gerald. Colleen's voice was not gentle. It was the voice of a woman who had managed 34 people through 9 days of disintegration and would not lose the 35th to sentiment. Get on the bus. Dean's rifle cracked again. Twice. 3 times. Faster now. The man in the Bengals cap said, We go in 30 seconds with or without your friend. Colleen said, He's not my friend. He's our medic. She looked at me. Gerald, the door is steel. It'll be there. You won't. I climbed the steps. The bus door folded shut behind me with a pneumatic hiss that sounded nothing like a dead bolt and everything like one. The driver, a woman I had not noticed, wearing work gloves and a surgical mask. Put the bus in gear. We moved. Dean's rifle fell silent. Then I heard him running. Dean made the bus. He came sprinting down Palmer Road at an angle that intersected our acceleration, and the driver, whose name I later learned was Marguerite, and who had driven this bus on this route for a school district in Preble County for 11 years, slowed just enough for the man in the Bengals cap to haul the rear emergency door open and pulled Dean inside by his rifle sling. Dean landed on the corrugated floor of the bus aisle, breathing in torn gasps, and said 2 words. They're following. Marguerite did not speed up. She maintained a pace that I estimated at 35 miles per hour, which seemed dangerously slow until I understood her reasoning. The road ahead was unverified. Vehicles, abandoned, crashed, stalled, appeared at irregular intervals, and at highway speed, any one of them could end the evacuation with a collision. She navigated these obstacles with the calm, spatial awareness of someone who had spent a decade threading a 40-foot vehicle through residential streets designed for sedans. I sat in a bus seat designed for a child's body, my knees against the seat back in front of me, my pack between my feet. Paul and Lisa were across the aisle. Lisa had her head against the window, watching the landscape pass with an expression I could not read. Paul was holding his injured hand in his good hand, cradling it like something newborn. The terrain between Dayton and Brookville is Montgomery County at its most featureless. Flat agricultural land punctuated by gas stations, dollar stores, and churches. In the early morning light, it looked emptied rather than destroyed. There were no fires, no overturned vehicles, no Hollywood desolation. There was simply absence. Fields with no workers, parking lots with no shoppers. A Taco Bell with its drive-through menu board still illuminated, advertising a breakfast item to no one. We passed a group on the road, 7 figures, moving east along the shoulder of Route 35, spaced apart in a loose line. They turned their heads as the bus passed. They did not pursue. Their movement was what the ham operator had described. Not walking, not running, but a kind of persistent ambulation that had no destination, only direction. They were headed toward Dayton, toward what we had left. Colleen sat in the front seat behind Marguerite, speaking into the 2-way radio. The Brookville group was coordinating arrival. The church was a Lutheran congregation on Main Street, brick, 2 stories, with a basement fellowship hall and a parking lot enclosed by a chain-link fence. Not a fortress, not a bunker. A building that people had used for potlucks and AA meetings and children's Christmas pageants, now repurposed into something its architects had never imagined. Gerald, Colleen said, turning in her seat, when we arrive, I need you to assess their medical situation. They say they have injuries. I'm not a doctor. You're the closest thing we have. I installed heating systems. You sutured Paul's hand with butterfly closures and proper irrigation in a basement with no running water. In this economy, you're a surgeon. Paul, overhearing, raised his bandaged hand in confirmation. He's good, Paul said. Weird, but good. The bus crossed a bridge over the Stillwater River. The water was slow, carrying leaves in a current that moved with an indifference I found obscene. The world's minor systems, rivers, weather, gravity, continued as though the major systems, civilization, safety, the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, had been optional all along. Brookville appeared as a water tower first, then a grain elevator, then the steeple of the Lutheran church rising above a line of maples that were half bare, their remaining leaves the color of rust. Marguerite slowed. The F-250 ahead of us turned onto Main Street. We followed the Suburban. The church parking lot gate was open. People stood inside the fence, 15, 20, I could not count through the bus windows. And as we pulled in, they did something I did not expect. They clapped. Not cheering, not shouting, clapping. The sound of palms striking palms, rhythmic and communal. The simplest human percussion. Lisa lifted her head from the window. They're clapping, she said, amazement in her voice, as though she had forgotten the sound existed. The church smelled like instant coffee and mildew and bodies and candle wax, and it was the most welcoming interior I had entered since the morning I left for the rooftop that broke my spine. The fellowship hall was large, commercial kitchen along one wall, folding tables stacked in a corner, cots and sleeping bags arranged in rows on the linoleum floor. Someone had taped paper signs to the walls. Water station, first aid, children's area, quiet zone. The signs were written in marker with careful lettering and their domesticity. The impulse to label, to organize, to impose legibility on disorder, moved me in a way I would not have predicted. I set up the medical kit on a folding table near the kitchen. The Brookville group's injuries were minor but numerous. A sprained ankle, a forearm burn from a cooking fire, 2 children with respiratory infections that needed monitoring, an elderly man with controlled diabetes, whose insulin supply was finite and dwindling. I triaged with the tools I had. My HVAC installer's knowledge of systems, pressures, flows, applied to bodies instead of ductwork. The parallel was imperfect, but not useless. A body is a system. It has inputs and outputs and tolerances and failure modes. What it also has, which a furnace does not, is the capacity to look at you while you assess it and ask, "Am I going to be okay?" The man with diabetes asked me this. His name was Franklin Coe, and he was 71, and his hands trembled not from his condition, but from the particular anxiety of a person whose survival depends on a manufactured substance that the manufacturing world has ceased to produce. I checked his glucose with a monitor from my kit and said, "Your levels are managed. How much insulin do you have?" He said, 12 days. 12 days. Not a wall. A window closing. I wrote his name and his number on a piece of paper and gave it to Colleen. She took it without comment and added it to her spreadsheet, which had grown from a neighborhood census into something resembling a field hospital's intake log. Colleen Marsh had found her function and was inhabiting it completely, not with passion, but with the grinding persistence of a machine designed for a task it will perform until it breaks. I recognized this because it was the same relationship I had with my basement. We were both people who survived by having a job. That afternoon, Dean organized a perimeter assessment. The church's fence was insufficient. Chain link, 4 feet, penetrable. But Brookville's Main Street offered structural advantages. The buildings were brick, contiguous, with few gaps. Dean proposed using the block itself as a perimeter, sealing the alleys between buildings with vehicles and debris. It was not my plan. It was not my skill set. I watched from the church steps as 30 people, residents of 2 different communities who had not known each other existed 9 days ago, began building a wall from dumpsters and delivery trucks and paving stones pried from the sidewalk. Paul worked with them. His hand limited him to carrying rather than lifting, but he carried with the focused energy of a man who had been stored underground for 7 days and was physically incapable of sitting still. Lisa helped in the church kitchen, organizing the combined food supplies with the same detachment she had applied to the basement. But here the detachment was functional rather than vacant, a useful distance from which to operate. In the evening, I stood on the church roof. Dean had posted a watch there, and I relieved the previous observer, a teenager named Chris, who attended the Lutheran congregation, and told me, as he handed over the binoculars, that the last normal service had been 2 Sundays ago, and the sermon had been about gratitude. The irony was available to both of us, and neither of us reached for it. From the roof, I could see east toward Dayton. The horizon was a low smudge of gray. No fires, no light, just the absence of the electrical glow that a city of 140,000 people produces, and that tonight it did not. My phone buzzed. I had not felt it in days, had assumed the towers were gone. I looked at the screen. A text from Nora. Dad, I'm in Columbus. Where are you? Columbus is 70 miles east. 70 miles of flat Ohio highway through territory I cannot verify, populated by a threat I have seen only at distance and in glimpses and in the sound of Dean's rifle firing at shapes I chose not to watch fall. 70 miles is an hour by car in the world that was, and an incalculable distance in the world that is. I stood on the church roof in Brookville and typed the name of the town and the street and the building. I told her to drive west. I told her to avoid Dayton. I told her I was here and I would stay here, and that wait here was a word I had not been able to say honestly in 3 years, because every place I had inhabited, the house, the marriage, the career, the basement, had been a place I was hiding rather than a place I was present. I am present now, on a roof in a small town, holding a phone that connects me to my daughter through a network that should not still function, and does, the way hearts function and rivers function and people clapping in a parking lot function. Not because the system is intact, but because the signal persists. She replied, "Leaving now." I went downstairs to tell Colleen we would need 1 more cot.